My name is Dorian, and this is Community Builders. This is a podcast where we look for the helpers in Chico, California. I'm joined today by my esteemed guest, Addison Winslow, recently voted Best Local Activist and Best Local City Official. Addison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
Typically, we're going to break this into three parts. I'm going to ask a little bit about who you are. I'm going to ask about the work you do. And I'm going to ask about why and what motivates you, what inspires you. So let's start off with that who. What's your elevator pitch for who is Addison Winslow? What do you tell people when you meet them?
In the context of me being a city council member.
Yeah, or a Chico community member even.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Chico. You know, sometimes mistakenly said to have been born in Chico. I was born in Louisiana because my dad was laid off from wheelchair factory, and there was some, for economic reasons, was down there, and that's where I was born. And then 10 days later, moved to California, and I grew up in Chico. I graduated high school early after getting expelled and going through continuation school and sort of a little bit of the juvenile criminal justice system, and didn't want to pursue more university. So I went and I was hoping to meet people that were trying to do good things in the world, right? Maybe somewhat like what this podcast is, but me traveling around doing that, hitchhiking around the country. And when I was 18 to 24 or so, we did a lot of that. And I got involved in community organizing and left-wing politics in a lot of cities throughout North America. Lived in central Mexico for a little bit. I was in Montreal when the Camp Fire happened. And I was working there in housing, community control of land, put on this conference. There's a community land trust there that I worked with, and I learned a whole lot of things from all these people doing this, all these movements in Montreal that were very matured. And then I saw what was happening in my community in Chico, and I didn't necessarily anticipate coming back to Chico anytime soon. I was kind of enjoying being a stranger in places and learning all kinds of new things. But it felt like it wasn't really sensible for me to be applying the things that I've learned in community organizing to these other communities that I am a stranger and a transient in when all this is going on in my own community. So I came back to Chico thinking I would just participate in the Camp Fire disaster recovery for a little bit, but one thing just led to another, and now I'm on the city council and then got involved in a lot of particular issues around housing and renters' rights and homelessness and development and all these things that in my mind tie together. And this is what the city is, what the future of the community is, and so I'm trying to be a good part of shaping that.
When you came back to Chico, or when you came to Chico, you were a kid? What age?
You mean as a child?
Yeah.
10 days old.
10 days
That's how old you
old.
have to be to get onto a plane. So my mom had bought a plane ticket to get out of Louisiana for the soonest that she could. When I was due, and then 10 days later she had a plane ticket. But when I was due, I didn't come out, so she had me induced so that she didn't have to get a new flight. Yeah.
That's a fascinating story. Do you have an earliest memory of Chico?
Earliest memory of Chico? There was a time, really vague memories. My parents were renters and moved around a whole lot. They got divorced when I was 5. So I lived in all parts of town, always in somewhat lower income stuff, duplexes, townhouses, apartments, but I remember one time we did live a little bit north of the park. When I was a small child, we could walk to the park. So I think that's probably my earliest memory of Chico would be entering the park on Valambrosia.
How do you feel the park has changed since that time?
Oh, there's still big oak trees.
Yeah.
I don't know that it has that much. People will say that it's you have homeless people in the park now. You definitely did before, but it's a little larger scale, and it kind of comes and goes, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the park is one thing that I think has remained remarkably consistent in Chico throughout my life.
So, you're a kid. You're going to the park. You went to school here in Chico?
Yeah, I went to Chico Day School for elementary school.
Oh, really?
School.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty popular one. Yeah, not a lot of people know this, but majority of the city council has some ties to Chico Day School. It's kind of suspicious.
Huh.
Yeah, Deepika's kid goes there. Casey's kids went there, and Andrew, Mayor Coolidge's kids went there. He was also on the board of it, I believe, at one point.
Interesting. Yeah. I didn't know that. We were recently there meeting the teachers for that Futures documentary.
Oh,
It
you
seemed
guys
like
did a video there. I think I saw that.
It's a beautiful school. What was school like in Chico? How was that experience?
Yeah, Chico City Day School was it's like a little bit of like a liberal hippie school. Not like entirely. Like it was pretty diverse because people enter the school because there's a specific like pedagogy there. You learn about one thing, and then they connect everything, all the other subjects to that thing. So if you're interested in like salmon as a unit, then you learn all about salmon, but you learn all kinds of other things in relationship to salmon. And it brought like interesting people in, like parents who had some like ideas about their kids having kind of a creative education. We did a lot of field trips. There was music and art classes and such, and so that was a really good experience. I think a good school to go to. I think the teachers were very friendly and kind of encouraged creativity. And there's still some people that I'm close friends with from that time in elementary school. Junior high was like, it gets to be a totally different atmosphere once you're in there. There's like hierarchies and such in a way that didn't exist in a small elementary charter school. And I didn't, especially that time. I mean, as a teenager, I was just not a particularly happy kid. Or I did some sports and stuff, but I think it was the time I was about 13. I started to want to just like get out of my house all the time. Learned that I could ride a bike across town. Met some kids from different schools. Would hang out at like a skate park and stuff. And my life changed a lot in that, and it ended up with a lot of like issues with me and my parents, and them being like, you're out late, can't do this. Weed is introduced into the scenario, and at that time that was like a really big bad deal, and so I ended up as a kind of like a troubled youth for sure. Hence the expulsion and all that. But in that time too, I mean, I developed like a lot of like close friendships, became more like socially involved to where I knew people not just through my school but outside of it. And I think that was when I as a person started to, I could say, blossom a little bit, but also it's like teenage years are not always particularly like, doesn't look healthy on the surface. It probably isn't, but I think it helps for overall character development. Shortly later in life, I think I developed into more of an independent person, having this like breakaway from everything within the household, within school, and that not being what dominated my life in those years.
Having gone through it.
And being able to be in like places in Chico, like exist freely. And I really appreciated growing up in Chico for that. It felt like the entire city was accessible to me. Once I could ride a bike all over, I could get anywhere, anytime. So we would just go on adventures that would take us like all over the place. And none of us really had cars even in our teenage years, but we still managed to get all over the place at all times and kind of inhabit any space within Chico. Spent a lot of time like in Little Chico Creek, like physically in the summer, like inside the creek was a hangout spot.
Very reminiscent of my childhood. As soon as I had a bike, I was going everywhere I could go. What's your favorite salmon?
Favorite salmon? Mm-hmm. Well, the big old Chinooks of Butte Creek are hard to beat.
That is the right answer. Okay. So you went to Chico Country Day. You did high school. You went through some of the trials and tribulations of being a teenager and all that comes with that. You moved around a little bit, and then the campfire happened. You came back because you realized he who has arrived returns, or something Shotwin. And then something else happens, and you're on city council. So what's missing in between there?
Yeah, the one thing led to another, snowball effect.
Exactly. What took you from coming back, helping out with the campfire, and now you're on city council? What did that look like, and what was it like? Maybe what I want to know really here is, how did local government in Chico kind of come on your radar, and at what point did you say, I want to be involved in that? Mm-hmm. What did that look like?
Yeah, so having been a participant in socialist movements throughout the United States and a little bit of Canada and Mexico, I came to Chico and I saw there was a chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, which after Donald Trump was elected in 2016 really blew up as an organization, became kind of a catch-all for people who wanted to do some like anti-systematic activity and activism. And it was a really good organization at that time. In some places it still really is, because it's a big tent. It's non-denominational socialist, so nobody's pushing dogmas or like a party line on you. It's an activist organization. People come together in order to work on projects and push just generally a vision of workers' control of the economy and democratizing things within our society. And so I really like that, because that's what I consider myself as generally a non-denominational socialist. And I think there's a million ways that things can go well. It's just not the way things are going right now. And having worked with that group elsewhere, I was excited to jump in here. And in particular, things that I had learned in other places where it was tenant union organizing, seeing that as a way for renters who are in this very key struggle in our society against their landlords who are taking advantage of conditions, in particular after the disaster. It was really bad here. And I met some other people that were into that sort of thing, had good intellect and ability to research and ability to show up and speak, and we formed a housing working group for the Democratic Socialists of America. And I and soon after a woman named Lauren Kohler were sort of coordinators of this tenant union organizing effort. And that, it wasn't actually my idea to get involved in local politics with that. I was really interested in the base building institutions outside of the government, and that those institutions can then represent themselves to the government. We wanted to help people organize. And some other people within the DSA were like, we should go to the city council and tell the city council that they should adopt just cause eviction protections. So we can't just kick people out for no reason, because there was this mass wave of evictions going on that we all knew about. We had canvassed and talked to people and just found across the board people are experiencing the maximum rent increases allowable under the price gouging laws, sometimes more than that. Sometimes they had these stories of getting the DA involved to try to get their landlord to push it down. We had whole apartment complexes that were blanket evicted for superficial remodels in order to justify jacking the rent up. And all kinds of things. And there wasn't really a resistance to it. The city had no mechanism for enforcement of the laws that existed to protect people. There wasn't really anybody that had a great interest in holding that work up. So we were trying to do that. But once it came on the agenda of city council via Vice Mayor Alex Brown, we showed up, and I was like, okay, I'll go too. I'm not trying to organize people to go to city council meetings, but I'll show up and speak on it. In that, well, they hung it out for us well enough. That it got on the agenda, barely. And then from that point, there was this kind of conflict between the landlords, the property owners association showing up, and the realtors, and then us and some other people that were supportive of the liberals who were then not in power at that time were siding with us, saying, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We should be doing something about this. And it moved into committee. And so there were some advances. We're like, okay, maybe we're going to get this, okay? So we wrote, Lauren and I wrote a whole package of this is what a tenant protection package should look like. Here's a whole, an array of policies that we can pass, and here's some different options within it and everything. And we were doing lobbying. That ended up shifting a lot of our activity into lobbying the city government. This went nowhere in the end because one of the liberal city council members who saw it in multiple committee meetings, it went back to the city council. And then instead of passing it or directing an ordinance to be drafted, they said, well, the Property Owners Association came to us with some questions that they didn't have answered at these, the 4 meetings that this has already passed through. And so in order to answer the questions and be fair, we should bump it back to committee. And that was January of 2020. So then the pandemic happened, and this just disappeared from the agenda, as with a lot of other things. So the liberals accomplished little of anything. Yeah, and at that time, he'd also been involved with the DSA, had picked up some other activities. We had a democratization working group, which was about the city being sued into district elections. And we're saying that we should take seriously a reckoning with the fact that elections are not well representative of the people. And we should make sure there's fair maps. And this is where there was this whole local history era of the Goldstein maps. A woman named Bryce Goldstein, who I worked with there too, made some maps that were kind of pushed by us jointly that looked a lot better because they were a lot more sensible. They weren't built around incumbency, where the people who are on the city council lived, which is all the maps that they had designed were based on separating them into their own districts. So it was anti-gerrymandering, but also for things like ranked choice voting and stuff. So part of the widespread of the Democratic Socialists of America's activity. We had all that going on at the same time. And then the pandemic happened, And we had to really shift gears. I remember we had this regular event at a local spot called Blackbird. It was a bookstore and coffee shop, and just every Friday evening we had a little thing called Coffee with Comrades. So people would just show up and hang out with us, and we would talk. Usually throw the Chico News and Review down and kind of go over it for the week and say what's going on. And we sort of shaped some initiatives out of there. We have all the people in the room who are like, yeah, this is important. We should do something about this. In this last Coffee with Comrades that ever happened, right on the eve of shutdown, everything was shutting down in 2020, and we were like, so somebody said, they say that like seniors aren't supposed to leave their house, like if you're elderly, immunocompromised, like you should just stay indoors, like don't go out at all. But like, how's my grandma gonna get groceries? And we see this dilemma here, right? And like with the guidance coming from the CDC and from the government, and the gap in any kind of service to make sure that people are actually okay. And we're like, well, that's something that like we can do. Really conveniently at this period, every single one of us got laid off all at the same time, So what this turned into is a mutual aid working group, Pandemic Mutual Aid, that was the most volunteer engagement I've ever seen. And like per capita for a place like Chico, it was insane. So I became kind of like de facto like volunteer coordinator. There's a lot of people working a lot. We had like twice daily meetings at this time. And we created this program of getting orders from people who weren't supposed to leave their house, and we would go and do grocery shopping for them. And we had all this like COVID protocol. At the initial time, we had no idea how things actually worked, so we were like changing gloves out between like going to the grocery store,
washing my vegetables. So I remember that.
It was very, very intense.
Yeah.
Somebody described us, or like there was somebody like posted like a meme or something of us like a transformer showing up, like I have your groceries, sort of so geared up for it.
Yeah. So that's real community organizing, right? That's like see a need, fill the need yourself, right? Not hire someone, not like form a action committee that's like, hey, my grandma needs groceries, let's go.
Yeah, it was, the reason why you consider it mutual aid is because, we're kind of doing charity work for people who are unable to like reciprocate in a certain sense. Like that was true. We flyered all the low-income senior complexes in town.
Yeah.
And that was where we got a lot of the people. Some people, it was shared around in like local resource pages. So people who needed it reached out to us, and we had a long spreadsheet of all the people who hit us up for groceries, and some of them became like repeat customers. Eventually, as time went on, people settled into like other services to do that, where they can like pay for Instacart or whatever, or figured it out somehow. But in that period, we filled the gap. But we did like political education with it, and it was like a meaningful like connection. We saw it as a symbol of intergenerational solidarity, of us having the means and feeling comfortable to still be active and put ourselves at risk a little bit going out in public, in order to make sure that people who had a higher risk going out in public didn't feel the pressure to do that, and it wasn't a matter of not having the economic means to feed yourself at the time. One of the things that we did that really like symbolized the whole thing is in some grocery orders for these elderly folks, we would put in a few avocados, and we had made a little card that explained, on one side it had the story of the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, 1912, and how the women from the textile mills marched, and their bosses kind of said, I don't understand why you guys are out here. You're not grateful. Like, we're paying you enough to like feed yourselves. Like, you're all like doing fine. And they said, well, we deserve bread, but we deserve roses too. And this is just a symbol of the working class deserving more than just the bare sustenance. And it's more than just what gets you back to work, but people should have nicer things in life, and we shouldn't just be scraping by. And so there's also, if you're familiar with like the Australian billionaire saying that like millennials can't buy a house because they spend all this money on avocado toast. So we kind of adapt that into the motif of you don't deserve just roses, but you deserve like avocado toast too.
Yeah.
You can have nice things, and it's okay. You should be able to have nice things and have the economic security. And so there's a little story of the Bread and Roses strike, and on the backside, an avocado toast recipe. So avocado is then a symbol of intergenerational solidarity. We're encouraging these older folks to have some nice things in life, just like millennials deserve. That we all deserve that equally.
Love to see that. I dig it. So I want to talk a little bit about, first of all, let me just connect a couple dots. So you get this exceptional movement behind your community organizing. You realize you make friends. You realize you kind of can build your own connections into this community. You apply, you submit the paperwork to run for city council.
Oh yeah, sorry, we're still a little ways off. From that.
Yeah, it's
There's
okay.
all kinds of movement stuff happening that time. In particular, things that influenced me to get to the position to run for city council. It was pandemic related. I think it's okay to share. I was dating Bryce Goldstein at the time, and she was on the planning commission, so that was a whole level of insight for me. She was also a transportation planner, had a background. She had worked for the city of Chico as a Civic Spark Fellows in the planning division, working on climate change related things. And this opened up me to a whole kind of world of like what is urbanism and how the city works in ways that I understood kind of intuitively because I traveled so much and I knew how to find good places. You know, you type in coffee on Google Maps and you see where there's the biggest concentration, and that's probably the place you want to hang out where you're going to meet some cool people.
Yeah.
There's going to be good social spaces to hang out in. And so I had this sense of like what makes cities good and how different areas do not feel good to be in. Having walked and taken transit and ridden a bike around, I had all the sense of these things, but it really became defined to me having known Bryce and her having like expertise in these things and us starting to like read things together and all that. The mutual aid group also switched gears somewhat quickly. I wouldn't say switched gears. We expanded into outreach in homeless encampments because all these homeless encampments were, according to CDC orders, supposed to stay where they were at. So we did what we could in order to service those encampments to make them less bad, with the overall political goal of establishing that it's better when you recognize that people are sleeping outside and you designate a place for them to be, and make sure their service is provided. So we provided trash service to encampments when that had kind of fallen apart. It used to be volunteers and park rangers would go through and pick up the trash. People would leave out on the trail. But in the pandemic, all that just stopped. They stopped doing any of that. And so you had massive trash piles accumulating where previously they would have been picked up by trucks. So we went out and started like substitute that service, brought trucks in, and would do dump runs. Started doing it within the city public works yard. We would just bring it in there, had a relationship with city staff in order to do that. And I got to know basically every homeless person in the encampment throughout Chico because we got a contract through, this was Project Room Key. It was a weird time. So as a socialist organization, under Safe Space, under True North Housing Alliance that runs the tourist shelter, we had some money from the state that paid me $200 a week for a bit to every day bring food from Chico Unified School District out to encampments, which was a way to kind of plug in, give people trash bags, talk to people about like the issues. I mean, I emphasized what I called civic responsibility through class solidarity. The notion being the cleaner you keep your encampment, the more the things are okay, the less likely it is that the police are going to come and just push you around. The more likely we're going to get to the ultimate political goal, which is that you have a secure, managed place to be, which has not happened, by the way. But we have fought for this for a long time. We've had battles over dumpsters and over bathrooms and hand washing stations. And at that time, we had liberals in office, and they provided some bathrooms and dumpsters. And we got some things. But, that's the whole story of homelessness. You probably get on a different podcast. The bigger thing, but this is how we were involved at the time, was trying to support these encampments to be as decent as they can, with the explicit goal, which was even enunciated by Alex Brown on the city council, of having a sanctioned place for the homeless people to be, so they don't have to be in the parks just willy-nilly, whatever public spaces happen to exist for them to squat on. So we were hoping to progress in that. We did in a way with the Warren settlement eventually, which I was involved because I knew all the unhoused people in town. Mm-hmm. So Legal Services in Northern California was interested in these rights violations that were going on as the new city council came in after 2020 and then started clearing people out en masse, 50 plus people in the rain with no shelter available to go at all at this time. And me having known all these people, I went and talked to them, and people would ask me, it's like, what do I do? I was sort of a liaison between unhoused people and the police at the time, and I could do the best I can to say, like, well, where can they go? And they would say, it's not illegal to camp everywhere, but we can't tell you where, like it's some kind of sick riddle we're expected to solve. And in that process, I had like a burner flip phone, and 7 out of 8 of the plaintiffs on the Warren v. Chico lawsuit were people that I knew and had on the phone with them, and they had good stories, the more compelling stories. So Legal Services needed some particular plaintiffs in order for this lawsuit to progress. So they found them that way. And I had a bunch of declarations on the lawsuit too, as far as like how many unsheltered people existed throughout Chico, what the interactions with the police had been, how these homeless encampments formed, how the consistent reports from people was the police basically directed us to go here. They said this is an okay place to be. Now they're coming in and sweeping everybody, and they won't tell us where we can go, and all those sort of things. So that was a little more depth of my involvement. Previously, I was working just with tenants, thinking that a lot of people focused on homelessness, and I didn't feel like it was as pressing a need. But as I met all these people, I felt that it is more of a pressing need, and I got to feel that the gravity of these decisions to clear people out with nowhere to go, and all the people who are just innocently there looking for one place to lay their head, to store a little bit of things, to, they're comfortable sleeping in a tent. They're not comfortable, but it's like this is the best option available to them. They would be anywhere. They would go on a tarmac lot out by the airport. They just want somewhere where they can be secure, and the city was adamantly refused to provide anything like that to them. And so one more piece that I'll just tie into, it's like how I ended up in the position to be a qualified-ish candidate for city council was in the pandemic. I started to get I did a lot of like bike rides around. Once the mutual aid stuff had kind of slowed down, and got to be really interested in every single little piece of Chico that I was familiar with, and like what the history of all these developments was. And I started going through like the Chico News and Review archive and just hotkey searching things to learn everything I have. So I have like a very large like glossary of local history, and it's kind of an encyclopedia, I guess, and on a Google Doc, and that was built through all this reading. I started getting into like more like deeper sources. Eventually started going to the Merriam Library, the special collections, and looking up things in particular. I was interested in particular in the 20th century and how we went from having streetcars and walkable neighborhoods to suburban sprawl, and the way that downtown and the central areas were re-engineered in order to facilitate automobile traffic through. We had to knock down some of the largest buildings in town to build parking lots for this unsolvable parking problem that existed once you started having people live at only drivable distances without sidewalks connecting them to downtown. And I didn't see there was a lot of attention paid to that, So some subjects like the history of 20th century racial segregation in Chico, things that I wrote about in the Chico News and Review later with some of that research. So I became increasingly just like a savant of all things about like development in Chico, which also led me to have like an interest in what are the new developments that are going on. Or maybe that was really that was what led me to look at the history. But so I worked with Butte Environmental Council and my roommates, one of whom, Maggie Scarpa, is now on the Planning Commission, and we reviewed the environmental impact report for Valley's Edge on behalf of the Environmental Council, looking at all the impacts, transportation, how many cars you're going to have going through there, what's the greenhouse gas emissions going to be, what endangered species are threatened by this. All of very, very legitimate critiques, according to most of the population, because this ended up culminating in the referendum that was successful, me just being on the city council at that point. So it was all in that context of me like having this kind of like spread out involvement of things. Later I was hired by Butte Environmental Council, that previously was volunteer work, to review the housing elements within Butte County, Oroville, Chico in particular, especially Chico's, and look into like fair housing critique, because the state had adopted all these new laws for this cycle. So cities now had to plan adequately for low-income housing to be built. And Chico wasn't really doing it in a lot of ways, wasn't in compliance with these laws, just like most cities were, because they're all new laws and you got to adapt to it. So I wrote a 30-page report on housing in Chico and how the city has obstructed the construction of new housing. And which did kind of add to like a literal resume of people started to interview me on the radio and stuff, because I'll just go on and on about like this like niche background of like local history of these like particular developments and like this one, and what battles were fought to like lead to these results, like why do we have mansions overlooking Upper Bidwell Park and stuff like that. And that was, I guess, the context where there were some people organizing for a recall of the mayor in late 2021, early 2022, and they sort of sent like a representative to ask me if I would run for city council because I was in that district.
Oh, so you got drafted.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in addition to niche historical knowledge of Chico developments, to me, what you did was you paved your own path by meeting the people and being in the places that you needed to be so familiar with this community that it was a foregone conclusion that you were qualified to represent people here. You were qualified to represent people from all walks of life, and in particular working people. I'm also curious, and steer this however you want it to, but day one, do you know what the first day on city council was by any chance?
Yeah.
What was it? Was it like the date?
Oh, it was December 6th, 2022.
December 6th, 2022. You kick down those double doors and you walk in and you go, I'm a non-denominational socialist. What's up? And how did they react? Because is that title in the minority in this city council?
Yeah.
And I'm also curious if you are interested in talking about what that means to identify as a non-denominational socialist. Yeah. And I also want to know, almost just for the benefit of the audience, the word Marxist gets thrown around really heavily, and I feel like it gets heaped onto socialists. And I wonder where you draw that line and what that distinction is for you, if you want to talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, sure. I mean, so a few questions there. One is, how is my socialism received on the city council?
Yeah.
Before I was even elected, Tom Van Overbeck and I kind of mutually acknowledged that we both thought we were going to win our elections. We both had some kind of like issues in common. And Tom, having lived a long time in the Bay Area, I think he's just gotten used to having friends who were liberals and such, and so he doesn't really have the same kind of like awkwardness as like some other like very like socially conservative people do. So he was like down to just kind of like talk and can kind of joke about it. So
to meet you where you are and to hear you out and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's like isn't like like I don't feel like he doesn't demonize me for an ideology. If anything, he kind of trivializes it as like, you're young and this is why you think this way, and I'm old and this is why I'm a Republican. Which is much better than a lot of alternatives of how people would deal with that. And I think it was a positive for me in just feeling like I can kick it anyway, even though it's like we have intense disagreements. They're political in nature. They're sometimes very moral in nature, but we can still kind of get along. I'll mention that the Enterprise Record still refers to me as a liberal. I've never in my life positively identified as a liberal. I take the term progressive, I think, more, but liberal, I feel like, defines something a bit more like fixed that does suggest that you're content with a capitalist order of things. You think maybe we can like moderate it a little bit, but ultimately like the elites are going to control society, but we're going to make sure that they control it with a little bit of concern for the other people.
And that's interesting too, because is the distinction there a North Star being equality of opportunity versus a North Star of equity of outcome? Is that like where that's
one way you can see it. I mean, I don't really look at it in terms of equality so much as I do. It's about democratic control of the important things in our society, and so not even like overall. I mean, the idea of like Marxism or communism with a capital C being like all-encompassing government control of the economy. Like, I don't think that that's really like important or necessary. It's those fundamental things that enable us to survive or thrive, and things like some of them like already are under government control. Tends to be like roads, education, but other things like power and water. And just like fundamentally like employment, like the fact that we can have a crisis. We do have like economic crises on a regular basis. Roughly every 11 years, we have someone that's significant, and it leads to a spike in unemployment to where millions of people, for no fault of their own, are now thrown out into the ranks of the permanently impoverished, those like that cannot help themselves. So right now we think about like homelessness. There is this like subgroup of people like down at the bottom who like don't make it on, but economic circumstances make that flexible to where suddenly it widens to encompass so many more people, and suddenly now it's like your family members, your grandparents are encompassed in it. And this is what happened with the campfire. Is family members of mine, I had cousins and brothers who suffered like layoffs, unemployment, rent hikes, and were pushed out of Chico or struggled to remain, and that is something that I think in the most basic sense of socialism is that we provide a security against that. We make sure that workers continue to have some like leverage in the whole scheme of things. You're not going to have to accept a pay cut in half because some bankers messed up and didn't properly assess the risk in their investments. That's not something that's going to affect normal people and ruin their lives. It's not going to destabilize our society. That's what I would argue. So there's some kind of big picture things. Municipal socialism is, I would say a little like different. It's like it can be similar in principle, but it's like we are working with a municipal government which has hard fiscal constraints, has hard legal constraints like all surrounding us. What the state government kind of preempts from us, what the federal government does. We don't control the Federal Reserve. We don't have a public bank for Chico. We actually could, and that would be one socialist innovation. It was like, well, we can shift some of the investment in our area into public hands, and we can make profitable investments in things like new housing in places where we think it should be, that we know we're going to generate a return, but do it with the democratic process. I didn't make a motion to have a public bank when I first entered the city council. I picked 6 things that I thought were like palatable enough that it's like this isn't a straight, like it shouldn't be a straight left-right thing. Like we should be able to discuss this. One of these, for example, was I didn't even ask for eviction protections, even though I had worked so hard to try to get those passed under a different council. I asked for us to have a discussion on reducing barriers to accessing rental housing, because you have people who either have an eviction on their record, don't make 3 times the rent, and we don't have any limitation on what landlords can demand. So because we had price gouging laws after the campfire, that meant you can only increase rent 10% of what it was at the start of the fire. And what a lot of landlords did then, when they couldn't jack up rent that way, is they could be more selective about tenants. So they have all this leverage because there are 20,000 new people looking for a house in Chico. And one of the ways that they used that market power was they started to be more selective and say, you need to have a cosigner or 3 times the rent, multiple lines of credit sometimes. I had my stepbrother tried to get a room in an apartment. He tried to get on the lease there, and my stepdad co-signed it for him. And they said my stepdad didn't have adequate lines of credit, even though he owns a house. He's got a mortgage that he pays. He's got a car loan that he pays. They said he needed more lines of credit in order to qualify as a co-signer. And this kind of thing that did not exist previously. And so I requested that we did kind of discuss this in general. We didn't get a second on the motion. For safe streets kind of things, it was like, I want to discuss having like community input in the road projects that we do. You see a lot of them going on. You kind of like, once they start tearing up the road, you're like, oh, they're doing this project, and saying that we should have some community hearings in order to make sure that people have an input and know what the streets are going to look like when we do it. Engineering is something that should happen after policy is set by people and representatives, and we don't necessarily have that process. And there's kind of like some creative things. The only one that got a second on the motion that first day was crime prevention through environmental design on the bike paths, and it still failed to make the agenda. 3-4 vote. So that was me not coming in as like, I understand that I'm a minority of one representing half or so of the city. Not everybody immediately wants to take over the means of production. Maybe PG&E, maybe we like that. We can take some steps in that direction. But I'm trying to represent more broadly and also be realistic about the powers and the limitations of the local government. So this is me as a municipal socialist in this way. And shortly after, so it wasn't like day one, it's like I don't say like, I'm a socialist, you guys all lick boots. Like I didn't quite say that.
Quite.
But when we had to increase our sewer rates because our sewer system, which is publicly owned, was insolvent. We couldn't fix the sewers. We didn't have the money to do it. We were dramatically underfunded by it, and these are paid for by sewer rates. It's called an enterprise fund. It is a business run by the government essentially to maintain the sewers. We had a pitch by Calwater, our private water utility, to take over our sewer network. They'd give us a bunch of money, and they would own it forever. And they said, we really look forward to being your sewer partners. And I made the motion to increase the sewer rates. It was a 7-0 vote. We all knew that it had to happen. There wasn't really much of an opportunity, but I made the case as a municipal socialist to explain sewer socialism, going back to like Wisconsin days in the early 20th century. And this was like the sense that the city government can provide good services for like health and sanitation, which became very influential. In fact, we kind of have this as an expectation usually throughout the United States at these days because of that. There was progress that was made that became very widespread. I said things like when there's a person who owns my house that I live in, I don't call them my house partner. That's my landlord. And increasing sewer rates is a necessary part of responsible management of public enterprises. And this is what we have to do in order to maintain services in the hands of the public, which saves us from being exploited the way that we are by PG&E for our power. And we don't want to put Calwater in a position to jack up rates on us more than we would on ourselves, because there's no reason that they would purchase our sewer network except to make money for themselves off of our backs. So if you see that, that's the way that like it comes in, and sometimes it's common sense in a lot of ways. Like we should have our own power. I think most people agree with that. But it's like, do we have a path to get there? And that's where being a socialist and not a liberal affects my approach. Is I am seeking to carve out a path, have a strategy and a long-term plan to move power into public hands, not just accept it as the status quo that we have a private utility regulated very intimately by the California Public Utilities Commission, and they still disappoint us all the time, and they still jack up rates, and we're still consistently exploited, and we still complain, but we feel like it's just out of our hands because that's the way that God intended it or something. No, we should take the power back.
All this is so fascinating, and I would love to talk like in depth about each of these things, but I also want to pivot to talk in the remaining time we have about you a little bit. Mm-hmm. And what made you as a person so interested in these things? And for the young Addison watching who maybe has an inkling that this is something that they want to be involved in, that community organizing, or that maybe they're riding their bike around or hotkey searching archival documentation to form an encyclopedic knowledge about historical developments. What's your advice? And why are you not an investment banker?
Maybe it was just like good upbringing, you know. Maybe it's that Chico has so many nice things that are just available to you just going around that I never had the ambition to be rich or anything. So going to university in order to get like a good job and buy myself lots of things never appealed to me. The biggest thing I've ever purchased myself before is my pickup truck. I bought it for $1,200. It's a 1984 Toyota. That was a big deal to me. Continues to be a big deal to like maintain that thing. And I just feel like there are better things in life than just making a lot of money. And also I just feel like a sense of insecurity in the long run about like all these things that are just the things that make us naturally rich going around here. You know, we have risks like our aquifer dropping and the urban forest dying in Chico. This is something that I don't see being solved by itself. You know, the people who are currently there, I don't see them solving it. And I think the more that I learned about history of movements of people trying to make the world a better place and what's happened to them and setbacks that we've experienced, the more I wanted to be like part of that history moving forward. And that's just what makes me feel more satisfied in life. That's the way that I have more enriching relationships with other people, is in working on these things together, to where it's hard for me to imagine just having like a normal, comfortable life.
That's so interesting. When you say a good upbringing, can I ask about your parents?
Yeah, my parents are. I mentioned like they got divorced when I was really young, but both really good people. Really, like just generally liberal in outlook, although not like really politically inclined themselves. Although my mom has come to be a lot more politically inclined in recent years, and probably my dad too. But less with like his own action. They both work at Enloe. My mom's worked in administration there for over 20 years. My dad's a nurse, surgical nurse. He became that after going through some training in Louisiana and going through nursing school here.
How excellent. Are they involved in their community? Do they, research historical developments? Do they meet people? Or are they a liaison between police departments? Or where did that come from?
No, neither are my brothers. I have 3 brothers.
Okay.
None of them are like that. I mean, they do cool things and they have friends.
Sure.
and they're good people. But no, that's just me. I don't know why in particular. I was a little nerdier, for sure. Had interests in developing encyclopedic knowledge about things. There's like the one stream of philosophy where you like want to have this like one idea to like unify all the things in one, and then there's the other to like categorize things. And I have both of those things. And so getting into municipal politics, it's like, here's all these areas of like city governmental functions, what is, what could be, what has been. And I just love to just put all that stuff together. And it's, that's like a good evening for me, is just like reading some interesting things like that. So that repeated over and over again, it just puts me in a position to have a good time working on these things. So it's stressful a lot for sure. And I imagine also like having a well-paying job would be stressful, or it is in a lot of ways. So I don't get paid well, and I'm stressed out. But there's a level of fulfillment that comes through it. And I've been able to enjoy that a lot. a lot of me for sure preferred just being a random activist doing things, being able to write articles about stuff and blogs and not have the pressure of being like
showing up to a podcast.
Showing up to podcasts. It's like how correct people expect me to be and how measured and moderate I feel like I need to be. I need to really be the person to sometimes introduce, like, here's the constraints in the situation. That's been a difficult thing, like being in office versus being an activist. Is when you're an activist, everybody's sitting around and like, I'm so mad about this thing, and like we should just do this. And getting in actual office and then having like, privileged access to information. I call department heads, I call the city manager, I get an answer to a question, I get explained what's the deal with this. You become acutely aware of all the limitations of things, and that requires, it's a sort of like realism that that can be sometimes a little depressing, maybe. And so I felt like some elements of being in office have maybe like not necessarily like a better or nicer person. And part of that is I find myself in meetings with people wanting to be like, that's not actually something we can do, and just introducing the the kind of the pessimist realist, Well, I'm not in essence, and like I maintain my principles, and I see paths that we can take, steps that we can take in order to eventually democratize more broadly the economy in Chico and actually solve problems like homelessness. I don't see it as like out of the question. It's not just about like management for all time. We don't have to endure poverty in the richest country in the world. We don't have to endure like a world where we're in consistent like militaristic competition with other world powers. These are all things that like can be solved and actually probably must be solved in our lifetimes if we're to have a decent planet for our grandchildren.
Do you have a favorite place in Chico you would recommend people visit, or a favorite thing to do in town that you think deserves a little more attention?
It's I almost feel like basic in the way that I have such an easy, obvious answer to that. It's 1 mile. Sycamore Pool, as it's technically named. I just had a friend visiting. I have another close friend visiting later this month, which I'm very happy about. And the first place that I take everybody is 1 mile. And I will take them back there multiple times during their visit.
Yep.
We'll just have like a picnic out there. We'll hang out. It's a good time of year. We'll go swimming. I think that it's it's the best place that I know in the world, in the way that it's just so central and accessible to people. People pass through it, but you can just sit there and spend all day there. Yeah. It's never really like overpopulated. The woodpeckers just enjoy it, and you just feel like you can be the woodpecker and like flutter over the water and go back to the sycamore trees. And also I see it as like something that can be emulated in so many ways. Like we don't have that much water flowing through everywhere. We have to treasure the water that we have. But 1 mile to me is like a street, in that you have these paths along it, right? So people just like walk through there and pass through, and that is like a street, and those are like the lanes that people pass through. There's no cars allowed on this street, 1 mile. But in the median, instead of having like a row of trees, we have this pool. But it is like essentially the same thing. You got like your green strip, they're just very big. You got the paths. You can have some benches along it like we do in First Street going through campus. And these are things that we can introduce more broadly throughout our community, is see streets as places where people can just enjoy time and
be a woodpecker or
more of the
salmon.
City, available to just sit and be a woodpecker.
I love it. Thank you. 1 mile is my favorite place too. Spent my whole childhood there. I'm grateful for the work you do on our city council. I appreciate your heart, your vision. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having such good questions and good reflections on things.
Thank you.